I'm going to test people, but those who happen to have banners, streamers, when you hear me say the wild whispering winds of Pentecost, shake that streamer, move that streamer. So if anyone's actually listening to me right now who has a streamer, I'm going to say something, and I'm going to invite you to wave that banner. The wild whispering winds of Pentecost. There's some. Do that one more time. The wild whispering winds of Pentecost. So that's going to be sort of a test. If I'm making any sense, whenever I see those banners move, it means that people are actually listening to me. And I'm going to get the bag and I'm going to hand them out. So all of them. So you're all going to give me feedback about whether or not any of what you're about to hear makes any sense. So I will hand this to Sylvia, who, as you will do, you will hand those out. The wild whispering winds of Pentecost. So while you're all using your streamers, Stephen played a piece of music, sort of an amalgamation of a piece. Does anybody know what that piece of music was? I hear voices, but I don't hear the words. I vow to thee my country. I don't no, but I'd like to hear that. That would be good. That's the original. Did anybody recognize that amalgamation of music? Alleluia. That's also a very good song and also a very good word, but that was not the piece. Sorry? You can't remember what it is in our hymn book. Is it in our hymn book? It is. It was actually an amalgamation of a collection of music called The Planets, which was written by Gustav Holst. He wrote it in 9 pieces from 1914 to 1916. And what he wanted to convey through those pieces was that the planets themselves convey emotion in our lives. And that connection with you, with me, the listener, literally affects us when we listen to the universe. Anybody ever heard of TED Talks, documentaries? I see hands, I see nodding. I see a banner. Awesome. Technology, entertainment, and design. The TED Talks are one of those amazing things that are happening out there where people with gifts and skills are actually sharing them freely. They're actually challenging us and making information available that sometimes doesn't get shared. You're going to hear 3 pieces from a woman who put together a TED Talk. Her name is Honor Hagar. She's a New Zealand artist. And her medium, one of her mediums, is the use of technology. You're going to hear 3 sounds. You're going to literally hear the sound of Jupiter. You're going to literally hear the sound that our sun makes and you're going to hear the moment of creation, the Big Bang.
The oldest sound that you're ever going to hear, the cosmic microwave background radiation left over from the Big Bang.
The wild, whispering winds of Pentecost. God's creation, this very place that we inhabit, is always speaking to us. It's always present. The question is whether or not we're listening. What is the universe saying to us? What is it that the Spirit that is always present wants us to hear? And maybe even more importantly, do we actually want to hear what the Spirit has to say to us? Because as we heard in the psalm, as we heard in the community of Peter, things get a little challenging when we start listening to what the Holy Spirit might be saying in our midst. The psalm that we heard this morning is a creation psalm. It's actually the third creation story in our scriptures. There's the Adam and Eve one, there's the 7 days one, and then there's this one. It is the story, it is the myth, it is the creation story of God's triumph over chaos. The Leviathan is a metaphor, and God calms the chaos. It comes out of an agricultural Palestinian context that describes the cycle of life and the connection to the land, and how, when open to the Spirit, the planet, the earth, life is renewed. The wild, whispering winds of Pentecost. The Pentecost moment, the 50 days after Jesus' crucifixion, the Peter community comes together. The community of Peter, maybe it doesn't translate well into text, but they're not doing really, really well at this point. They're scared. They don't understand what's going on. They're also in grief. The man for whom they've, in some cases, are literally putting their life on the line, they're now being persecuted. They're now being chased. And then Peter says to them, the Holy Spirit that's always present flies through us. When we listen to those flames, our languages, what we're saying to one another, becomes translated. We can actually hear what each other is saying, and by extension, discern what it is the Spirit intends for us. In the piece from the community of Peter, then Peter's talking in the story of Acts, he ends by indicating that the kingdom to come, the blood, all that stuff that sometimes we're not comfortable with, doesn't happen in the future. It starts now. When we start to make choices, when we start to listen to the wild, whispering winds of Pentecost. Of course, we're 2,000 years removed. We're here in the 21st century, and what does that have to do with us? What are the challenges that we might need to hear in our own contexts? So I've been thinking about that, and some of them that I thought we could talk about would be Vince Lee, the man who performed horrible acts on another human being and yet suffers from mental illness. And the media coverage about that has, in my experience, been demonizing. We could talk about mental illness, and do we actually talk about it, or are we so scared that we don't engage in truthful conversation? That was one challenge I thought we could talk about. Another one might be student protests in Quebec and what's actually occurring in English media as opposed to what's actually happening on the ground there. And asking some questions about, do we believe every single soundbite that we hear just because it's over an airwave? I thought that would be an interesting challenge to talk about. And listening to the news again this week, I've been listening as people are striking or talking about striking, and we're talking about those labor relations and a history of fighting to ensure that you're paid a decent wage, and some would say that that's being degraded. I thought we could talk about Regina in 1935, June 14th. That date mean anything to anybody? I thought we could talk about how it's easy to forget that in 1935, men who were unemployed in this country who couldn't get a job started on the trek called On to Ottawa. And there were thousands of them. And they ended up in Regina, and Prime Minister Bennett at the time took note and listened. And they went back to their jobs that they might have had, and their incomes doubled. I thought we could talk about that. And if anybody would like to talk about anything I've just said, give me a call, send me an email. We can go for coffee and talk about any of those topics. But that's not the place where I went. I thought we could talk about the F word. Now, for those of you who have already been online and happen to read my blog, you're not allowed to answer the following question. And I have a pen here. What do you think the F word is? Faith. I'm writing these down because this might be another F word reflection at another time. Faith, okay? Any others? Family. Future. Forgiveness. Fun. Oh, I like that one. Feelings. Freedom. Okay, I better stop you now because I don't have a really cool thing I could type all these up and then, or somebody to type them for me. Those are all really good F words. It's not the F word I went with, though. So which F word? Feminism. The feminism word. The reason the feminism word has been with me comes out of a recent time when I was in a learning circle in Edmonton. For those of you who don't know, I'm back at school, which is really exciting. I figured that I've been in school now for about 35 of 41 years. I don't know what that has to say about me. Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment, but there you are. And we were doing ready stuff and talking stuff, and we were reading an article about feminism. And in that group, there were 18 of us, men and women. There was a literal, observable change in people's energy and demeanor when we started talking about feminism. There were people who were angry with that word. There were people who were uncomfortable with that word. And that got me thinking. It got me curious because words that make us uncomfortable in our Christian tradition sometimes are called prophetic. Because a prophetic voice in our context, it irritates us. We don't want to hear that. We don't want to hear what that has to say. Prophetic voices are unsettling because sometimes we actually have to start looking in the mirror if we're going to take them seriously. Prophetic voices raise challenge. Challenges maybe we don't want to talk about because then we have to look at our own families. We have to look at our own church communities. We have to look at our own society. And the really, really, really irritating thing about prophetic voices is they just speak their truths unabashedly and unapologetically. They don't actually care what you think. They're just going to give you the challenge. We've got to hear the challenge. Are we prepared to hear the challenge? The wild, whispering winds of Pentecost. Okay, the left side's not as awake, so I'm going to have to stand over here. So for those for whom feminism might actually be a new word, a new F word, I'm going to share a little bit about it. So feminism is just a word. It's a lens. It's a particular way of looking at the world. It's a magnifying glass. At its core, as a movement, as a form of analysis, as a form of saying, so what does my family look like? What does my society look like? What does my church look like? Feminism says the world is constructed on a power basis, on a structure that's run by men. And everything else trickles down from that. The fancy word for that is patriarchy. It's a movement, it's a lens, it's a way of seeing the world that talks about those who happen to have power. In this context of feminism would be men. And by extension, what does that mean for those who aren't men? What does that mean about things like equality? Who has access to what? Whose voice is silenced? As a movement, as a lens, as a way of seeing the world, feminism asks questions. And in particular, it forces us, when we're listening, to question our assumptions, to confront them. And that's really, really hard to do. So what? So we're a church. Feminism's a secular thing, doesn't really have anything to do with us, right? What does it mean to the United Church of Canada? What does it have to say to the United Church in Meadowood? What does it have to say to you in your lives, in your own families? The early church wrestled with these same questions about who was in and who was out. And I think in our 21st century context, we're a little apathetic about the question. I think we're comfortable. I'm not certain whether or not we actually want to hear this challenge anymore. We'll talk about anymore in a minute. When I got curious about the physical response to the word feminism, it struck me that in the United Church of Canada, where you, me, don't take for granted that our pastor, our minister, our reverend can be a woman, that we can actually say to the daughters, the women in our midst, that you can be anything you want. We're not the norm. Don't kid yourself. Don't think this is normal. We need to hear that. We need to face the challenge that our context, our own history, is grounded in this wrestling and an awakening to what the Peter community, what those early disciples realized about their own faith community, that Jesus accepted everybody. And the early church and the examples of those who offered leadership were as varied by gender and as experienced as they were by anything else. And it was the Spirit that was the determiner, not man's determination. 1936, Lydia Grucci. The wild whispering winds of Pentecost. Okay, test moment. Who's Lydia Grucci? First female minister ordained in the United Church of Canada in 1936. Seems we've been doing this a long time, right? Did you know it took her 10 years to finally get her Master's of Divinity recognized for ordination? 10 years. Every 2 years she had to reapply to recognize the ministry that she was already doing in our midst. She was ministering in areas that were underserviced and that were shunned by male ministers, where male ministers wouldn't actually go. Often male ministers educated, not uncommonly in the East, and they didn't want to come to certain places. Do you know where those certain places were? West, prairies, underserviced areas, places that when it snowed, you weren't going anywhere for a long time. When it rained, you weren't going anywhere for a long time. Took her 10 years. We as a denomination cannot forget the work that we have done when we consider the lens of feminism. Church Union, June 10th, 1925. The wild whispering winds of Pentecost. This is at an arena in Toronto when our three denominations came together. You can't see everybody, but there's like little dots and like little, they could be bald. It could be. It's a room filled with men. We're getting there. Good question. 1925, Church Union. There were 7,646 people in attendance. 4 of them were women. Now, I'm not a mathematician, so I had to use my calculator. That's 0.05% of those in attendance at the union of our denomination, where they all got together and perhaps their shiny heads were shining, and there were only 4 women. Mothers home looking after the kids. And thank goodness that occurs. And thank goodness that families have also changed and that whoever's home are the ones that offer that love and care. But the reality is, as of 2011, the population ratio in this country is that 51% of us are women. Now, I don't want to mislead us, because it's also important to go back and not forget our context, that according to our archival history as a church, those who were most active sort of look like we do today. About 51 to 54% of the people who generally filled the pews then, chairs now, were women. That the archives show that a lot of the work that happened behind the scenes to make that union happen was in fact done and performed and initiated by the women in our midst. We have been a community that struggles. We are a community that endeavors to live into an egalitarian idea. Big word basically means we all have access. We all get to have the Holy Spirit come into our lives, and we get to say we trust that Spirit is leading you to change us. Sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. We, as the United Church of Canada, are not the norm in this country, and most specifically on this planet. So what does that mean, not to be the norm? What does it mean to say we're starting to look through these lenses? We're starting to maybe reclaim the lenses that we've always had, that the word feminism isn't necessarily a new one to us. Or at least the word itself might be new, but the way of looking at the world isn't. Well, it means that we start having to ask questions. We need to start recognizing that things, the way we see them, may not be what actually happens outside of this sanctuary on a Sunday, on a Monday, on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. What it means is that for the women in this room right now, I issue you a challenge. Consider the women, the girls, the youth, the young women in your lives. What messages are they hearing? And what are you doing about those messages? And as a male, I issue this explicitly to you. We have an obligation as brothers in Christ to walk in solidarity, to stand up, to use the power we have in this culture to live out the gospel. Because if we don't, So we're moving towards the end of Richard talking. And Richard's not probably going to end with a tight finish, if you will. He's going to give you homework. So you might not like what I'm saying. You might not in any way agree with me. You might not like the connection of feminism to Christianity to the challenge of actually doing something with your faith. That's cool. We'll do coffee. But before we do coffee, I want to give you a list of questions, and I actually want you to consider them. I want you to watch the TV. I want you to go online. I want you to listen to the radio. And maybe choose just one of these questions. And then come back to me. Especially come back to me if you're uncomfortable right now after wrestling with this question. And maybe you might have shifted. So, question. So what percentage of women are actually in municipal, provincial, or federal politics in this country? What's the percentage? Low. What is the earning parity of women to men? Parity is a big fancy word, so how much does a woman get paid for the same job that a man makes? Less. How are women portrayed in the media? This is a really good one. When an influential woman is covered by traditional media, what do we talk about? What's the soundbite about that woman? What she looks like. Who endures the horror known as domestic abuse? Larger, broader question. Good one for coffee? Maybe not. Maybe. Let me know. How do oppression issues, how do people who suffer this system, how do other issues such as race, class, sexual orientation connect with women? How many career options are implicitly barring to women? And maybe even more pointed, how many career options are explicitly bar women? The wild, whispering winds of Pentecost. How do we live into these questions? Because they're not easy questions. And the gift of a sanctuary filled with people who endeavor into discipleship is that we get to ask them. But do we become paralyzed? Do we become apathetic to the questions? Are we so numb that we leave this sanctuary and that was a good service, thanks? I don't know. Let me know. We'll do coffee. I'm going to challenge you that it's not necessarily about answering specifically every single one of those questions. It's not about going out and gathering data. It's about asking the question. Because you start asking the question and the world starts to look different. And when the world starts to look different, you've got choices to make. The kingdom to come that the Pentecost moment illustrates for us is that when we hear and we see and we translate what it is that's being whispered, something that's being yelled at us, we have a choice to choose into the way that we walk together. So we're going to sort of end with a video. This video comes from Carl Sagan. Anybody know who Carl Sagan is? Who? A famous astronomer. Yes, he was definitely a famous astronomer. He also wrote some really good science fiction. He was an agnostic. He was a skeptic, both in his scientific career and when it came to faith. In particular, he was skeptical about a Christianity or any faith that reduced the holy to some bearded guy sitting on a cloud pulling our strings. That was his critique of Christianity. That was his. As an astronomer, he constantly challenged. And he challenged us that how we as a species, regardless of what you believe, regardless of what you don't believe, how we interact has to be grounded in humility. Has to be. He was involved with sending out the Voyager spacecraft. When that spacecraft looked back at Earth for the first time, he issued a challenge that there is no more powerful way to be humbled than to see the place where you live. Anybody ever traveled abroad? I'm going to stereotype, but I'll ask the question anyways. Did you come back here and realize what you had? There's no more powerful way to be humbled, to make change when you see your home from far away.
The spacecraft was a long way from home. I thought it might be a good idea, just after Saturn, to have them take one last glance homeward. From Saturn, the Earth would appear too small for Voyager to make out any detail. Our planet would be just a point of light, a lonely pixel, hardly distinguishable from the many other points of light Voyager would see, nearby planets, far-off suns. But precisely because of the obscurity of our world thus revealed, such a picture might be worth having. It had been well understood by the scientists and philosophers of classical antiquity that the Earth was a mere point in a vast, encompassing cosmos. But no one had ever seen it as such. Here was our first chance, and perhaps also our last, for decades to come. So, here they are. A mosaic of squares laid down on top of the planets, and a background smattering of more distant stars. Because of the reflection of sunlight off the spacecraft, the Earth seems to be sitting in a beam of light, as if there was some special significance to this small world. But it's just an accident of geometry and optics. There is no sign of humans in this picture. Not our reworking of the Earth's surface, not our machines, not ourselves. From this vantage point, our obsession with nationalism is nowhere in evidence. We are too small. On the scale of worlds, humans are inconsequential, a thin film of life on an obscure and solitary lump of rock and metal. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering. Thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization. Every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every supreme leader, every superstar, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dot. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. It underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the only home we've ever known. The Pale Blue Dot.
May it be so.